Something happened off the coast of Florida that nobody expected. Not the engineers who designed it, not the marine biologists who studied it, not even the scientists who spent years carefully monitoring every inch of the ocean floor where it occurred. They dumped 500,000 tons of oyster shells into the sea, and what grew back was something that defied every cautious, conservative scientific prediction they had made. What emerged from that murky water, slowly and silently and with absolute certainty, was one of the most breathtaking ecological comebacks in modern American history. And the story of how it happened, why it happened, and what it means for the future of our oceans is something every person alive right now needs to hear. Because this is not just a story about oysters. This is a story about what happens when human beings stop fighting nature and start working with it. It is a story about the ocean's extraordinary capacity to heal itself, if, and only if, we give it the right foundation to stand on. And it is a story about a creature so small, so overlooked, so routinely eaten with a squeeze of lemon and a dash of hot sauce that most people have never once stopped to consider the enormous, almost incomprehensible power it holds over the health of our coastal waters. Let's go back to where this all began. Because to understand why dumping 500,000 tons of oyster shells into the Gulf of Mexico was not an act of carelessness, but an act of desperate, calculated ecological necessity, you need to understand what Florida's coastline used to look like. And you need to understand what happened to it. For thousands of years before Europeans arrived in North America, the coastal waters of Florida teemed with oyster reefs. Massive three-dimensional structures of calcium carbonate built not by any human engineer, not by any geological force, but by generation after generation of the eastern oyster. The species scientists know as Crassostrea virginica. These reefs were not just piles of shells sitting on the seafloor, they were living architecture, complex layered ecosystems, where hundreds of species of fish, crustaceans, worms, barnacles, and invertebrates found shelter, food, and breeding grounds. They were the beating heart of Florida's estuaries. And for the fishermen, the families, the communities that lived along these coasts, they were everything, the foundation of a way of life that had existed for generations. Apalachicola Bay on the Florida Panhandle was once known as the oyster capital of Florida. At its peak, it produced roughly 90% of the state's entire oyster harvest. 90%. The town of Apalachicola was built around those oysters. The restaurants, the processing plants, the fishing boats, the culture, all of it grew up in the shadow of one of the most productive estuarine ecosystems on the entire Gulf Coast. Oystermen passed their knowledge and their boats from fathers to sons, from mothers to daughters. It was not just an industry, it was an identity. And then it collapsed. Not slowly, not gradually, it collapsed. In 2012 and 2013, the oyster fishery in Apalachicola Bay fell apart with devastating speed. A combination of forces hit the bay simultaneously and without mercy. Upstream freshwater management, the diversion of river flow for agriculture and municipal use in Georgia, reduced the flow of fresh water into the estuary, pushing salinity levels too high for juvenile oysters to survive. Overharvesting had already depleted the reef structures that adult oysters depended on. Then came drought years. Then came the pressure of commercial harvest, continuing even as the population was crashing. By 2013, Apalachicola Bay was declared a federal fisheries disaster. The oyster beds that had fed a community for generations were gone, and with them went the fish, the crabs, the birds, the clarity of the water, and the livelihoods of hundreds of people who had built their entire lives around those reefs. But Apalachicola was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a pattern playing out all along Florida's coastline and far beyond. Scientists studying the global distribution of oyster reefs have determined that 85% of the world's native oyster reef habitat has been lost. In some regions, the number is closer to 99%. The eastern oyster, once so abundant along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts of North America that early European explorers wrote about reef structures large enough to damage ships, had been systematically destroyed over centuries of overharvesting, pollution, habitat destruction, and disease. What had taken thousands of years to build had been dismantled in less than 200. And what disappeared with those reefs was not just shellfish, it was the entire web of life those reefs supported. Because oyster reefs are what marine ecologists call ecosystem engineers, organisms that physically reshape and create the environment around them, making habitat possible for hundreds of other species that would otherwise have nowhere to live. When the reefs went, the fish went with them. The blue crabs lost their nursery grounds. The water, no longer filtered by billions of living oysters, turned murky and green with algae blooms. Seagrasses that needed clear water to photosynthesize began to die. The ecological cascade that followed the loss of oyster reefs was not subtle. It was catastrophic, visible, and measurable, and it was happening all along Florida's coast simultaneously. This is the world that Florida's conservation scientists and restoration ecologists inherited. This is the problem they were asked to solve. And the solution they reached for, unconventional, logistically enormous, and at first glance almost absurdly simple, was oyster shells, mountains of them. Here is how the logic works, and why it is actually one of the most elegant pieces of ecological engineering ever attempted. An oyster cannot attach to soft sediment. It cannot begin its life as a free-floating larva drifting through the water column by simply landing on a muddy seafloor and deciding to grow. It needs a hard surface, something solid, something rough and calcium-rich that its larval form can grip, anchor to, and begin the process of building its shell upon. In nature, that hard surface was always provided by the shells of previous generations of oysters. The reef built itself by building on top of itself, each generation of oysters dying and leaving its shells as the foundation for the next. It was a self-perpetuating system, and it had worked perfectly for thousands of years, until there were no more shells left on the bottom to anchor to. That is the core of the problem. Once a reef is destroyed, once the shells are gone, removed by harvesting or degraded by time, the seafloor returns to soft sediment, and soft sediment is a desert for oyster larvae. They drift through the water, searching for a surface, finding nothing and dying. The reef cannot rebuild itself because the raw material for rebuilding, the shell substrate, has disappeared. The ecological feedback loop that sustained the reef for millennia has been broken, and natural recovery becomes essentially impossible without intervention. So the intervention is, put the shells back. Starting as early as 2007 and scaling up dramatically over the years that followed, Florida began a series of oyster shell restoration programs that would eventually involve collecting, processing, and deploying shells at a scale that is almost difficult to comprehend. Shells were collected from seafood restaurants up and down the Gulf Coast. Oyster shell recycling programs recruited restaurants in Escambia County, Santa Rosa County, Lee County, Charlotte County, and across the state. Operations where the shells that would otherwise end up in a landfill were instead gathered, cured in the sun for months to eliminate pathogens and bacteria, then transported to restoration sites and deposited on the seafloor. Between 2007 and 2024, the accumulated scale of these efforts reached an extraordinary figure, somewhere in the range of 500,000 tons of recycled oyster shell placed back into Florida's coastal waters. 500,000 tons. The weight of roughly 500,000 cars dropped into the sea, not as waste, but as the foundation of a living reef. And then something remarkable happened. Something that, even to the scientists who designed the programs and predicted the outcomes, exceeded the most optimistic projections. The shells landed on the seafloor. They settled. They piled up into irregular mounds and ridges, their rough calcium carbonate surfaces extending in every direction through the water column. And within days, not months, not years, but days, the ocean responded. Bacteria arrived first, forming biofilms on the shell surfaces. These thin biological coatings are not random. They are ecological signals. The chemical compounds that biofilms produce attract oyster larvae drifting in the water column. It is as if the shells broadcast a message across the water. Here is a surface. Here is solid ground. Here is where you can begin. The larvae receive that message, and they come. Within weeks of shell deployment, researchers monitoring the sites began recording the settlement of juvenile oysters, called spat, onto the shell surfaces. This recruitment phase, well documented in coastal restoration science, is the critical gateway. If spat settle successfully, if they survive the first vulnerable weeks of their lives and begin to grow, the reef has a chance. And on the clean, calcium-rich surfaces of the recycled shells, settlement rates were extraordinary. The density of shells accelerated the process far beyond what typical natural timelines would predict. It was not just working, it was working faster than anyone had reasonably hoped. With the oysters came everything else. Within the first year of reef establishment at restoration sites across the state, marine biologists cataloged extraordinary increases in biodiversity. Barnacles moved in, tube worms colonized the crevices between shells, mud crabs arrived, grass shrimp appeared. And then the fish came, attracted by the abundance of invertebrate prey suddenly concentrated in a small area, drawn by the three-dimensional structure of the reef that gave them shelter and ambush points. Juvenile red drum, spotted sea trout, sheep's head, black drum, and flounder, species that form the backbone of Florida's recreational fishing industry, were recorded at reef sites in numbers that compared directly to healthy natural reef communities. The reef, built from restaurant oyster shells and careful ecological planning, was functioning like a wild reef within a single year of its construction. But the ecological transformation went deeper than biodiversity counts and fish surveys. Because the oysters themselves, as they grew, as they matured, as they reached the size where they could begin filtering water at full capacity, began changing the chemistry and clarity of the water around them. A single adult eastern oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water in a 24-hour period. Read that sentence again. 50 gallons every day. for every single adult oyster in the reef. A mature reef covering just a few acres can contain millions of individual oysters. The collective filtration capacity of even a modest restored reef is staggering, removing suspended sediment, algae, harmful bacteria, excess nutrients, and chemical contaminants from the water column continuously, around the clock, every single day. The impact on water clarity was visible, measurable, dramatic. In the waters around restored reef sites, turbidity, the scientific measure of how cloudy or murky water is, dropped significantly compared to adjacent areas without reef restoration. And clearer water means more sunlight reaching the seafloor. More sunlight on the seafloor means something extraordinarily important for the entire coastal ecosystem. Seagrass can grow. Seagrass beds are the other foundational ecosystem of Florida's coastal shallows. Like oyster reefs, they are ecosystem engineers. They stabilize the sediment, produce oxygen, sequester carbon, and provide nursery habitat for juvenile fish and invertebrates of almost every commercially and ecologically important species in the Gulf of Mexico. And like oyster reefs, Florida's seagrass meadows have suffered catastrophic losses, damaged by boat propellers, smothered by algae and nutrient-polluted water, and starved of sunlight by the same turbidity that the loss of oyster filtration created in the first place. The connection between oyster reefs and seagrass beds is not coincidental. It is a biological feedback loop that scientists call a positive ecological cascade. Oysters filter the water. Cleaner water allows seagrass to photosynthesize. Seagrass meadows stabilize the sediment, preventing it from being resuspended and clouding the water again. Stabilized sediment means cleaner water, which supports more oyster growth, which filters more water, which supports more seagrass. The two ecosystems, functioning together, reinforce each other in a cycle of recovery that, once started, can sustain itself and expand. The restored oyster reefs at Florida's shell deployment sites were not just rebuilding themselves. They were creating the conditions for a broader ecological recovery that extended well beyond the reef boundaries. They were rebuilding the web. At the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation's Marine Laboratory, which has been conducting oyster reef restoration projects in Charlotte Harbor and surrounding waters since 2007, the results of years of work came together in a way that made even seasoned researchers pause. By 2025 and into 2026, SCCF had restored more than a dozen oyster reefs covering a combined total of 7 acres in the region, reefs in Clam Bayou, Pine Island Sound, San Carlos Bay, and Tarpon Bay. In January 2026, the group completed what became their most ambitious project to date, a 3-acre restored reef in the mouth of the Caloosahatchee River, built using 6 million pounds of ancient fossil oyster shells. Shells tens of thousands of years old, mined from an underground deposit near Babcock Ranch in Charlotte County, where ancient bay bottoms had been preserved under layers of sand and sediment over geological timescales. Think about that for a moment. Ancient shells, laid down when Florida's coastline was in a completely different location, dug up from underground, and placed back in the water to seed a new generation of living reef. Time folding back on itself, the ocean using its own fossil record to rebuild what it had lost. And at the Turtle Bay Restoration Project in Charlotte County, in one of the most recent and closely monitored efforts, the feedback from researchers and wildlife observers has been immediate and remarkable. Jimmy Michaels of the Coastal Conservation Association of Florida, standing at the site, described watching birds arrive at the newly formed oyster bar almost as soon as the shells were placed. Bait fish schooling over the new reef, birds diving for them from above, crabs moving through the crevices below, an ecosystem assembling itself in real time in response to the presence of a structure that had simply not been there before. The scientific data from University of Central Florida, research on oyster reef restoration in the Indian River Lagoon, one of the most biodiverse estuaries in North America, and one of the most severely degraded, showed that restored reefs shifted the species diversity and community composition of invertebrates toward states resembling healthy, live natural reefs within just 12 months of restoration. Species abundance, the sheer number of organisms living in and around the reef, recovered to natural reef levels within 18 months. 18 months. For ecosystems that took thousands of years to develop originally, the speed of recovery when given the right substrate is extraordinary. But here is the part of this story that carries the most weight. The part that takes it beyond an inspiring conservation success story and turns it into something with implications for how the entire modern world thinks about environmental degradation and ecological repair. Because Florida's oyster reef crisis is not unique. It is not a local problem created by local mismanagement. It is a snapshot of a global pattern that is playing out in every coastal ecosystem on Earth. 90% of the world's oyster reefs are gone. In many regions, including parts of Europe and Asia, the figure is even higher. The same pattern, overharvesting, pollution, habitat degradation, loss of the shell substrate that future generations of oysters need to settle on, has played out in estuary after estuary, bay after bay, coastline after coastline. And with each reef lost, the same cascade has followed. Murkier water, less seagrass, fewer fish, eroded shorelines no longer protected by the wave-dampening structure of a living reef, increased flooding in communities behind them, and the slow, grinding collapse of the commercial fishing industries and coastal cultures that depended on those reefs for their existence. In Apalachicola, after the fishery collapse of 2013, the state closed the bay entirely to oyster harvesting in 2020. The closure lasted 5 years. It was a painful decision that devastated communities that had already been devastated by the collapse itself. Restaurants lost their menus. Processing plants closed. Oystermen who had worked the bay their entire lives had nowhere to go. Franklin County, which surrounds Apalachicola Bay, lost a defining piece of its economic and cultural identity. The closure was not punishment. It was triage, a desperate effort to give the ecosystem enough breathing room to begin recovering before what remained was destroyed completely. The recovery has been slow, slower than anyone hoped. As of early 2026, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission's most recent monitoring results showed that restored reefs in Apalachicola Bay are among the only areas in the bay with oyster populations large enough to consider for limited, carefully managed harvest, with thresholds requiring a minimum of 400 bags per acre of legal-sized oysters before any given reef can be opened. The bay is recovering, but it is a fragile, provisional recovery, one that remains vulnerable to the same forces that destroyed it in the first place. Freshwater mismanagement upstream, excess nutrient loading, the long shadow of decades of overexploitation. And this is the central tension at the heart of the Florida oyster story. The shell recycling programs, the reef restoration projects, the careful scientific monitoring, all of it is working. The ecological science is sound. The results on the ground, or rather on the seafloor, are real and documented and genuinely remarkable. But restoration is only part of the equation. If the forces that destroyed the reefs in the first place continue unchecked, if freshwater management upstream remains divorced from the needs of estuaries downstream, if nutrient pollution from agricultural runoff continues to feed the algae blooms that smother growing oysters, if the regulatory frameworks governing harvest don't evolve quickly enough to protect recovering populations, then every oyster shell placed on the seafloor, every restored reef, every recovered acre of seagrass is fighting against a current that never stops pushing in the opposite direction. The restoration of Florida's oyster reefs is not a problem that gets solved once and then stays solved. It is an ongoing relationship between human beings and a coastal ecosystem that has been fundamentally altered by human activity. The shells are the beginning. The water management, the pollution controls, the harvest regulations, the community engagement, those are what determine whether the beginning leads to something lasting or whether the reefs that are growing right now will simply be destroyed again in another generation. But here is what gives reason for genuine, grounded, evidence-based hope. Because in the places where the work has been done well, where the shells have been placed thoughtfully, where the monitoring has been rigorous, where the community has been involved in both the restoration and the protection of what grows, the ocean has answered with everything it has. The biological response to restored reef substrate in Florida's coastal waters has been faster, more complete, and more ecologically complex than the cautious predictions of conservative scientific models suggested it would be. Life, given a foothold, does not hesitate. The story of what formed offshore when Florida dumped 500,000 tons of oyster shells is ultimately a story about that, about what the ocean is capable of when the conditions for recovery exist, about the extraordinary biological machinery of the eastern oyster, a creature that filters 50 gallons of water a day, that builds architecture from its own body, that creates habitat for hundreds of species while doing nothing more than eating and growing and reproducing, and about what happens to an entire coastal ecosystem when that machinery is taken away, and what happens again when it is returned. The shells on the seafloor did not stay shells. They became homes. They became hunting grounds. They became nurseries and filtration systems and wave breaks and sediment stabilizers and seagrass meadows. They became fish. They became birds. They became cleaner water and healthier coastlines. And the slow, steady return of something that was nearly lost forever. They became proof of something that is desperately needed in an era of environmental crisis and ecological despair. That recovery is possible. That when human beings stop extracting and start restoring, the natural world can and does respond. That the ocean is not dead. It is waiting. Patient, resilient, and extraordinarily capable, waiting for nothing more than a foundation to stand on. 500,000 tons of oyster shells dropped into the sea, and what grew back was something that nobody who has watched it happen has any easy words to describe. Not just a reef, a world, an entire breathing, filtering, feeding, spawning, interconnected world, rebuilt from the ruins of what was lost. That is what formed. And if we are paying attention, if we are willing to do the hard, unglamorous, decades-long work that ecological restoration actually requires, it is only the beginning of what can grow.